round of presentations for 596A. We have 5 presenters up for today, covering a interesting array of topics. So first up, let's hear from Bridget Wall.
Hey guys, I'm Bridget Wall, and I'm going to be giving you my proposal on mapping changes and relationships between environmental and security issues from 2014 to 2021 in Niger's Tillabéri region. So here we go. So here's the bottom line up front. Environmental degradation is the focal point for this project. At the top is desertification, which is exacerbated by climate change, and that's a major driving factor that contributes to environmental degradation in Niger's Tillabéri region. So then there's 3 other factors, including first to the left, growth in refugees and IDPs, or internally displaced people, camp sizes, violent extremism to the bottom, and tensions between pastoral and agricultural communities to the right. So in the background of this presentation, for the next few coming slides, I'm going to break each one down and describe each's impacts on overall degradation of land in the area. So the Sahel region is just south of the Sahara Desert in Africa, and that's one of the largest deserts in the world. So the Sahel itself, it's a semi-arid strip of land that on this map, it's marked by those striped lines. There's been a steady decline in rainfall since the 1960s, and the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, expects that this trend is only going to continue. So this decreased rainfall combined with sea surface temperature changes, unsustainable agro-silvo pastoral practices, they all contribute to this slow but steady trend in which the Sahara's arid landscape is going to be pushing further south, which is a process known as desertification. So in the next slide, we'll go into violent extremism in the region and the impact that it has, as well as how it's impacted by these other factors. So this map depicts areas of violent extremism in Western Africa. The purple outline is Boko Haram. That's an extremist group that came out of the Islamic State. The green outline is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, which holds influence in the northern Maghreb region as well as the Sahel. So a big, huge swath. Several branches came out of AQIM in the past years, to include JNIM, which don't ask me how to actually spell that out. Very complicated word, but we're going to call it JNIM for now. And the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, or better known as ISIS-GS. So both of these groups, JNIM and ISIS-GS, operated mostly in Mali and Burkina Faso in 2012 and then going forward until recently, in which both have started to increasingly cross the Nigerian border in 2019, and that's to increase their area of influence. So the orange box is the Tillabéri region in Niger, which is my area of study. And on the next slide, I mapped attacks by these 2 groups, JNIM and ISIS-GS, in this Tillabéri region. So as you can see, in 2018, most of these attacks, they were restricted to Niger's shared borders with Mali to the north and Burkina Faso to the west. But as time went on in following years, these attacks began to stretch further into Niger. So there's also evidence pointing to the likeliness that they collaborated on numerous attacks. Please note the shorter time frame in 2021 is only 3 months. I was limited by my data, but the sheer number of attacks in only the first 2.5 months in 2021 just show that violent extremist activity in the Tillabéri region is still very much ongoing. There was a January 2nd raid on 2 villages of this year, which killed over 100 civilians, and that was marked as like one of the deadliest attacks in the region in recent history. So yeah, still very much ongoing. So how does this tie into land degradation? In more austere environments, there's evidence that violent extremists can operate more freely and are more likely to avoid government oversight. There's also evidence that frustrated pastoralists in the region may turn to or assist these groups if their pastors are unlikely to support their herds. Pastoralists are quite sought after by terrorist groups because they know the land and tend to have influences on tribes in the region. So lastly, increased violent extremism leads to increased refugee and internally displaced person, or IDP, camp sizes, which has been shown to increase land degradation in their surrounding areas. So I'm going to go into that next. So this map to the right shows a multitude of UN High Commission of Refugees, or UNHCR, peoples of concern. And this includes locations for mostly refugee camps indicated by those red tents. There's also IDP locations indicated by the green pins, as well as asylum centers that are indicated by the blue pins to the south. So as you can see on here, the majority of refugee and IDP camps are located near the Malian border, which makes sense because you can see on the bar graph on the right, there's almost 50% of the people of concern in Niger's Sahel are Malian refugees themselves. So as violent extremism continues in the region, there's no signs of it really stopping. So these populations of concern will most likely only increase. So that could drive either an increase in number of camps or increase in existing camp sizes. There's evidence that although agricultural production usually increases in areas surrounding camps in order to support the people who live within them, this land that's used for agriculture is typically not healthy, nor is it properly sustained. One study that I looked at used multi-temporal synthetic aperture radar, and they found that there was almost like 12% natural resource decrease within 5 kilometers of a refugee camp in Kenya, between a 17-year span. So as these violent extremist groups continue to operate in the region, this can only exacerbate land degradation areas surrounding camps as these both refugee and IDP camps continue to increase in size. So the last piece of the puzzle we'll discuss is tensions between pastoral and agricultural communities, which, as you can see here, is mostly just impacted by climate change and desertification, and then environmental degradation and the growth in refugees and IDP camp sizes, but it may actually lead to a rise in violent extremist activity. So this table 2.2 to the left, this summarizes how certain factors could either restrain or accelerate events that might turn to conflict. So I want you to focus on the economic piece highlighted in orange. In the second column, what could restrain violence is a harmonic existence between farmers and pastoralists, but what could accelerate violence is an increasing population as well as a declining agricultural or pastoral productivity. So as the Sahel's environment gradually starts to look more and more like the Sahara, this is going to likely continue to push pastoralists further down south as pasture to the north becomes more sparse. So as Niger's population grows, farmers will need to expand their agricultural area, thus increasing the likelihood that farmland might very well be co-located in the same regions as this pasture land. So there's evidence that shared space between them can lead to conflict, as they now have to fight over resources such as water, or for instance, like a herd damages a farmer's crops, or a new farm disturbs this transhumance path of a pastoralist. So as I mentioned before, pastoralists, they're valuable recruiting candidates for violent extremist groups. So tensions between a nearby farmer or another pastoral group, this could make the opportunity to join these groups that much more appealing, as they would be able to be armed and protected. So although tensions between these demographics doesn't necessarily drive land degradation, there may very well feel effects of it over other populations. So now that I gave you a background of the issue, here's my 2-part research questions. So question 1 is, how have environmental conditions, to include land use, land cover, and ecosystem productivity, changed between 2014 and 2021 in Tillabéri, Niger? And then part 2 are these environmental changes spatially correlated with refugee and IDP camps? I'll go more into my data 2 slides from now, but big picture, the 2 maps to the right will be my main data sources. So the first one is Landsat 8 imagery of the region. And then to the right is these UNHCR people of concern locations. So this is a quick rundown of the approach I will use/used. I am now on step 4, which is the formal proposal. Over the summer, I expect to continue my data analysis and results, and then depict all this in a formal report/presentation in the fall. So for data and methods, like I said before, I'll be using Landsat 8 7-band imagery that I've mosaicked and clipped specifically to the Tilbury region in March 2014, March 2016, March 2018, and March 2021. So I picked March 2014 because Landsat 8 fully kicked off in 2014, and I wanted consistency in satellite and sensors for my analysis. And then I picked March for both consistency and because it's one of the months that experienced the least amount of rainfall. So that was in order to reduce cloud cover. I picked up a few clouds in March 2016, but this shouldn't drastically affect the outcome of my findings. If it does drastically affect it, I can nix March 2016 and then focus on the 3 other years. So using this data, I'm gonna conduct a supervised land use/land cover classification using ArcGIS Pro's image classification wizard for all 4 separate years. My classification will likely come down to forest, grassland, cropland, desert, water, and then urban. Although there may be other types that I decide to classify based on what I find. I'm then gonna conduct an accuracy assessment using ArcGIS Pro's create accuracy assessment points, and then cross-reference them, my imagery with Google Earth imagery, because that may very well have a higher resolution than my current 30-meter Landsat 8 resolution. I'm then going to calculate normalized digital vegetation index, or NDVI, during each time period using ArcGIS Pro as well. So after both these analyses, I'll conduct a time series change analysis using ArcGIS Pro's compute change tool between each time period and as a whole between 2014 and 2021. So then going on to question 2, I plan to do some sort of spatial correlation analysis between these areas of land use and land cover slash NDVI change to the locations of refugee and IDP camps to see if there's any spatial geospatial relationship there. So I haven't fully decided how I'm going to do this, because I haven't found a way to do actual quantitative spatial correlation analysis on 2 different data sets, only among different attributes of my same data set. So any suggestions that you guys may have would be greatly appreciated. If it might come down to it, it might be some sort of qualitative type analysis if I can't find what I'm looking for. So my anticipated findings. So what do I expect to see after all this? So in the northern Tilbury region, I expect to see a decline in ecosystem productivity. That would be identified by a lower NDVI, as well as a decline in pasture land cover. In the middle, in southern parts of the region, I expect to see an increase in ecosystem productivity and an increase in cropland cover due to increases in agricultural production. And then I would also expect to see a decrease in pasture land cover, as the emergence of farms may interrupt pasture. And then around these refugee and IDP camps, I expect to see an increase in cropland cover, but a decrease in NDVI, because of the research I found that agricultural practices surrounding these camps, although they might exist, they may not be sustainable. So why does any of this matter? This project is intended to highlight the multitude of implications as a result of desertification and land degradation in the region, and shows just how all these aspects are connected. There's been, initiatives to try to slow these processes. I've I found one called the Great Green Wall, and it's basically an effort to increase the amount of trees throughout the Sahel. And there's many others, but all in all, they've shown little effect in the grand scheme of things. I'm in the military, and counterterrorism efforts are mostly all I hear about, especially when it comes to the Tilbury region. But I think there's other ways to suppress or even squash this bug, which is just all the havoc in the region. And that may very well start with just paying some more attention to this degrading landscape in the region. So these are my works cited, and that concludes my proposal. Ready for questions?
All right, Bridget, great job on your presentation.
Thank you.
We'll wait for a few questions to come in, but in the meantime, I have one that I hope you can entertain. I noticed in your slides you had the Landsat images were of March for each year. Was there anything particular about March, or were you going to consider including other months to develop sort of an average, for example?
Yeah, I touched upon it briefly. March seemed to be my best bet when it came to the least amount of cloud cover. And truth be told, like, it just took a lot of time to get all that data together and combine the bands and mosaic everything. But if that seems to be, if I need to find, a shorter time period of changes, then that very well might be an option for me to go through several months throughout the year.
Okay. It looks like you have some questions in the chat window.
All right, so Ryan Baxter, thank you, appreciate it, first of all. It can be really hard to differentiate between land covers like pasture, grassland, and agriculture. Have you run any tests yet to see how you might go about that? Do you have other land cover data sets for this region you could use to check your classification? So I have done a little bit of research on supervised classification just in general, and how it can be, I agree, how it can be especially difficult to classify something like pasture. And that is definitely why I chose a supervised classification over unsupervised, because it's going to take a lot of user effort, and is definitely going to need to be like some sort of cross-referencing with better resolution imagery, such as something from Google Earth, or if I can find anything better. I've gone through the entire internet to try to find better, like, high-resolution imagery of my entire area of interest, to no success. So for the sake of consistency, Landsat was my best solution. But I definitely, I think that might be my greatest challenge, especially with a land cover as challenging as pasture. I think that's going to be one of my greatest challenges. But if anybody has any suggestions, then by all means. Panagiotis, you want to try to find differences in refugee locations, right? I think satellite images of night lights coverage could be a very good tool for you to assess potential differences over time. That's a good idea. Yeah. So as far as that stands, I have a current idea of what the refugee locations look like. This data was pulled in 2019, this UNHCR refugee location shapefile. So I have a good idea, but that's a good idea to see if anything's changed since 2019. Not that you change your course now, but Google Earth Engine is a way to access all the Landsat data without having to download all the data to your PC. Just a suggestion. That kind of hurts to know that now. But I might have to check that out.
Bridget, there was a question from Beth King early on.
Okay. Oh, yep, there it is. The table of restraining and accelerating factors was really interesting. do you see an outcome of your project, the addition of environmental factors to that table? I don't know if it'd be an addition. That's a good point. Yeah, maybe if enough people find that this is an actual concern, that would be the hope, right? I think that's it for now.
All right. Great job again, Bridget. Thank you for your presentation. And if you could stop sharing.
Sounds good. Thanks.
So next up, we have Michael Haxel. Michael, if you want to start sharing. It does look like he is in attendance right now. So how about we move on to our next presenter, if that's okay. Oh, maybe Mike's just joining us now. Looks like he's trying to connect. We'll see if that's him. Mike, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
All right, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, hold on one second. Oh.
There we go.
Should I start presenting or it's not?
Yeah, we finished a little bit early, so if you want to go ahead and start presenting, that'd be fine.
Okay, hold on one second. Let me get this piece of gum. Well, hello, everybody. Today, I will be discussing the electrical vehicle charging network and its accessibility in the United States. My focus will be in the state of Texas. So, okay, so I wanted to start talking about electric vehicles because they've been in the news lately, and a lot of companies and government agencies have been starting initiatives, policies, or gearing their manufacturing lines to start producing electrical vehicles and also to start building charging networks. So I've included 3 major articles in here. One is from VW or Volkswagen, one of the largest producers of cars in the world, and they're expecting to do half US sales electric by 2030. Also, Volkswagen is committed to doing 70% of its European sales by 2030 to be EVs as well. The next article on the right explains the formation of what's called the Electric Highway Coalition. It's a coalition of local energy companies in the southeast of the United States. They have formed together and they would like to form a connected electrical charging station network using DC fast chargers. They want anyone traveling on the highways, kind of shown in the map there, to be at least, only 20 to 30 minutes away from a DC fast charger. And finally, the White House, part of Biden's American Jobs Plan, he wants to push a large investment into building charging stations throughout the United States and training the local workforce to maintain them. So this is the overview of my project. Go into objectives. I'm not going to go too much into this because I'm going to show the slides, but Okay, so my research objectives, I want to focus on defining accessibility in what's called the Capital Area Council of Governments of Texas. It's called CAPCOG, and it's essentially the Austin, Texas metropolitan area. What I would like to do is focus on the relationship between electrical charging stations and their surrounding environment. And by that, I mean like local job areas, retail centers, entertainment venues, and parks. I will be looking at socioeconomic demographics from census blocks, but I will also be examining the charging stations themselves, looking at mean averages of charging stations to these locations themselves. I want to measure in distance, in miles, and I also would like to measure in minutes. I'll go into a little more. So I started along this route by looking at past articles, and in the first article itself, I learned about how a lot of network analysis is based off of opportunity-based outcomes or accessibility. In the first article, Chen looked at amenities and their locations to charging stations in the state of California. The second article, which was done by the National Research Renewable Energy Laboratory, they looked at projected electrical vehicle ownership against the total number of charging stations throughout the Columbus, Ohio region. What they were able to do was create a standardized weighting measure to determine whether public charger quantity meets present electrical vehicle charging demand. And finally, the last article from Lee and Miller, they examined opportunity-based accessibility to determine how far jobs and healthcare were from the local city bus line, again, in Columbus, Ohio. And they use what's called a potential multimodal network area to determine local accessibility within 30 minutes and then regional accessibility. And I looked at these three to incorporate different ways of measuring accessibility. Okay, so my justification for electrical vehicle ownership, justification. I looked at electrical vehicle ownership rates throughout the United States. And what I came across was Texas has the fourth largest number of electrical vehicles registered in the country, yet their most research is predominantly in California and what's called the West Coast Electric Highway, which consists of Washington, Oregon, and California itself. There are other studies, but they're mostly isolated to metropolitan regions. Like I mentioned, Columbus, Cincinnati is another one. Another justification I have is urban vehicle contribution to overall greenhouse gas emissions. This is something that I was stunned by when I saw is that light duty vehicles, or what we would think of common vehicles that we drive, make up the majority of greenhouse gas emissions for the transportation sector. With that in mind, it's also worth pointing out that Texas also has the second highest rate of car ownership in the nation at around 8 million. That is private and public. So to measure or look at accessibility, I needed to define it. And so what I defined it in three different ways. I looked at travel cost, which is the time and the distance. That's what I'm going to use as my measure. The attractiveness of destinations, shopping centers, workplaces, and then units of measurement, time again, distance. Okay, so I looked at what was called distance decay, and what I found out was, according to this theory, was that about 65% of walking trips are within a quarter mile, and about 18% are within a mile. So this gives me an estimate of how far people are willing to, if they take their car to a charging station, how far they're willing to go around that surrounding area and visit stores, workplaces, or recreational centers. So I defined it within 10 minutes. for the time aspect, and then within a quarter mile for distance. Okay, so this has been brought up in past capstones. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I will say that the largest amount of electrical vehicle charger types in the CapCog or Austin metropolitan region are level 2 chargers. That's also the most common charger type in the United States. On average, a level 2 charger can take a standard battery electric vehicle and give it about 10 to 20 miles of charge for every hour that it's sitting there on the charger. It's not 100% efficient. DC or direct current fast charge is the most efficient, but it's also the most cost prohibitive. It could charge 60 to 80 miles within 20 minutes. But as I said, there's economic burdens that come with it, and installing themselves can be a burden on a local municipality. All right, so here's the CapCog region. I wanted to show this because the area itself is interesting, and I think it presents a good study area. You have the core Travis County where the Austin city limits are. And as you expand out to William, Hayes, Burnett, Bastrop, and Caldwell County, you have the suburbs. And as you go further out, you have the rural areas. So I want to look at the charging stations within each one of these and see what the average distances and the times are from amenities or workplaces, etc. This is another thing I wanted to bring up just to, because these are some of the factors I'm going to be looking at within the region. I'm going to be looking at multiple different types of socioeconomic demographics, but median income is very important for this region. Another important thing that I wanted to show on here is the distribution of chargers throughout the CapCog region. It's as you can see in Travis County, there are 963 chargers compared to Burnett County where there's 4, or in Lee County where there's 8. I do want to point out in 2010, throughout the entire state of Texas, there was only 26 public charging stations, and by 2020, that number has already increased to 4,500. This is very self-explanatory. This is going to be my timeline of development for my capstone project itself. I'm currently in the green May to June phase, developing, creating tools. I'll move on to conduct preliminary analysis, refine, and then continue on to conduct my final analysis, begin writing my final paper, detailing my results, select, develop my presentation, and then eventually present. So the good part, my research approach. So I obviously want to gather all the data sets, past research. Most important part of my research approach is the build section itself. So I want to build what are called service areas, and they are produced by the network analyst tool in ArcGIS Pro. I want to use these service areas to determine the accessibility per charging station. And I have an example of what a service area is later. And so to do that, I'm also going to need to build aggregating tools because some of the data sets I have are very dirty and they need to be refined to actually conduct examination on them. That goes along with my automating the scripting tools. As I stated earlier, just to analyze the relationships between these stations, socioeconomic demographics, and available destination types. These are some of the data types or sources that I have acquired currently to start building this analysis. I have electrical charging stations, the county boundaries, road network. I was able to recently find address points for the CapCog region. I do need to contact the authority that's in charge of it to see what the limitations are regarding use of that specific layer. I'm also going to use census, track, block, and group data And then I was able to find electrical vehicle registrations by zip code. That will also need to be cleaned using a tool I'll show you in a moment. So this is a simple tool I created really quickly that I use to aggregate and filter electrical charging stations in the CapCog region. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I had to convert certain fields, create new fields, and then create the layer itself. This can also be used or modified to take electrical vehicle registration by zip code and then filter it into maybe an associated census block or zip code. This is what I'm going to use to create county, city, town, census block, and census block individual layers. This also can be very easily modified. I had to just change a few parameters, the expressions themselves, but this will allow me, if I were able to find a particular area of interest, to immediately be able to go look at it instead of spending hours trying to refine the layer itself and then finally work on it. And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about service areas themselves. So I created this the other day using the generate service areas network tool. And I took 2 charging locations in northern Austin. I used the parameter of a quarter mile of walking distance, and I defined limitations and cutoffs for the tool itself. So I had to define facilities. So I obviously put in electric charging stations. I put it in as walking mode. And what it did is it created excuse me if I say this wrong, it's an isochronic lines. And what they basically do is they give you the average distance you walk, not the average, they define the distance from the charging station itself. So as you can see, like the orange line is about almost a quarter of a mile. As you get into the purple, they are the quarter mile. The 3 red dots are 3 retail stores that were identified within walking distance of the charging stations themselves. And I guess I didn't go too much into it earlier, but I'm looking at retail or entertainment areas because most level 2 chargers take a while to charge. And most people are not just going to park their car in a parking lot and just sit there for 3 or 4 hours. They're going to associate this with an activity that they're going to do. So they can knock both of these out at a time. So in this case, I have 4. One of them is the Hep grocery store. I have a Petco, a Foot Locker, and a Sears department store. Each one of them, dependent on the activity, would spend a general amount of time that would charge the car to an appropriate rate, I guess, to leave. Finally, I just wanted to bring up data or infrastructure limitations. I had the modifiable aerial unit problem. Aggregating the data, either in census blocks, tracts, county level, can be problematic, and it is a limitation I need to present and show that there will be a margin of error. Some of the other major limitations, and I've tried to veer away from them, are specific charger levels and connector types. There's over 10 different connectors that come from the charger that you plug into your car. I cannot, I don't have enough time in this semester to look at all of them, and then to bring it another level of complexity. Actual cars, electrical cars themselves, the models, the series, the years produced. Tesla, for example, you have the Model 3, you have the Model Y, and each one of them, they have different battery capacities, different levels of charge that they could take, different levels of adapters that they use. Tesla is mostly standardized, but a lot of other companies aren't. And defining accessibility itself is a very limiting thing. I can define it through time or distance, but I need to be careful on the interpretation of the data itself. I guess leave it up to questions now.
All right, Mike, that was a very great example of a practical application for your capstone.
Thank you.
So good job. One, looks like we have a question coming in already in the chat window.
Okay. Data. Are there other data sets you still need to track down, and do you okay, so yes, Ryan, 100%. I would like to find building footprints or associated land use layers. They're very hard to come by. Some of them that I have seen have warnings on them themselves saying that they're not 100% accurate. In terms of private companies, I have been denied by every single private company that I have introduced myself to, mostly because of proprietary reasons. They don't want to share certain parts of their data because it will not give away, but it will give the bread and butter of how they conduct their analysis. Is that the only one? I'm sorry.
So far, sometimes it takes a little while for people to write or type up the question.
Yeah, it's something I'd bring up another part of it. Something that I've also came across is a lot of government or public research that I've actually seen into gaining other data sets. They're mostly focused on the accessibility of chargers from traveling on the highway. So say if I wanted to travel from Washington, DC to Miami, will I be able to hit a charging center or charging station along the route? Whereas most private companies have focused more so on the individual levels of cities, and they buy GPS data on local vehicle patterns and traffic patterns.
So one question that I had, you'd made mention that there were a drastic increase in the number of charging stations that came online. So for any given metro area or county or what have you, there's really two trajectories. There's one that would be suggested by your research, right, where to put these charging stations. And then there's the other trajectory that planners have already figured out in their minds where they're going to place charging stations, right? So there's two kind of independent things here. Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought to trying to bring these two together as a way to either confirm that, yes, charging stations go here or there, or are you going to try to integrate sort of the ongoing placement of charging stations in your study?
Yes, and that was part of, I didn't have time to go into it, but the Columbus, Ohio research study that was done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, one of the things they looked at is optimal site selection, and that is something I would like to, like you said, bring in to my research too. Another point that I wasn't able to include in here was I have seen preliminary research talking about a change in the way that people refuel themselves. So I guess the better way of saying it is that instead of going to the fuel station, then the driver going to the fuel station, they might just charge at home, and that might be the new trend going forward. That does have limitations with your the type of house that you have itself, but that is something else that I guess I could include on top of what you were saying.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, I have another one. Have you ever considered looking? Yes, I have. I cannot find I guess like reliable. So James asked, have I considered looking into consumer demand for electrical vehicles? You might expect a higher demand in Travis County, but less in surrounding. I have tried to look into consumer demand for electric vehicles themselves. It's very hard to, I guess, find a reliable source that had, where the study was all encompassing, where I could use that to define other regions or other counties outside of Travis, if that makes sense. But it is something that I would like to include.
All right. Thanks again for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Great job. And next up, we have Timothy Dolan. So Mike, if you want to stop sharing. And Timothy, if you want to kick your presentation off.
All right. Can everyone see my screen and hear me all right?
Affirmative on both.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Dolan, and I'd like to welcome you to my MGIS capstone proposal presentation, Demystifying the Fuzz, Building a Flexible Fuzzy Logic Tool. Before I get started, I'd like to congratulate my peers on pulling through this past year and getting to this pivotal point in our GIS careers, as well as thank our advisors and professors for keeping us on track to do so. A special thank you goes out to my advisor for this project, Dr. Panos Giannakis, for his ongoing guidance and support over the past 10 weeks and months to come. Me seeing an issue with trying to hit next. Okay. Throughout my presentation, I'll be following the outline shown here, and let's get started. As GIS professionals, we use our skills to acquire and analyze data to solve myriad questions that are either brought to us or we ask ourselves. While some of these questions can have cut and dry answers, many do not, including those related to site selection. The site selection process in general is complicated, and while there are definite wrong answers, there can be several correct answers, all depending on different factors with both spatial and non-spatial components. One of these factors is the ever-changing criteria we are considering for our site selection analysis. These criteria are based on data that is certainly not static. Through improvements in technology and access to open data portals, we can incorporate data that is newly created or updated every month, every week, or even every 5 minutes. The criteria used in yesterday's analysis may no longer be relevant for the same one we plan to do tomorrow. In addition, the criteria we consider in our analyses changes priority shift within an organization or at the direction of external stakeholders, especially through top-down decisions and not always with much notice. But identifying the data we're going to use is only the beginning. Once we've settled on the best criteria for our analysis at any given point in time, we are tasked with incorporating the diverse set of preferences and opinions of our colleagues to come up with the best answer to our question. Each criterion we work with and its individual importance does not exist in a silo, but instead varies based on the preferences and opinions of decision makers involved and the other criteria we include in our analysis. As GIS professionals, we are lifelong learners, but deadlines draw ever closer, and at times draft analyses need to be run before any extensive research can be completed. After all, our leadership is only looking for the necessary core information and for it to be as easily digestible as possible through clean tables and cartographically pleasing maps we've worked so hard to perfect along the way. Not only is there an overabundance of data, as described earlier, but there's also an overabundance of tools for GIS practitioners to explore before they are aware of what is even available to them for their purpose. Those newer to GIS face the daunting task of navigating not only an overwhelming sea of knowledge, much of which is contained in financially and linguistically inaccessible academic articles, but also learning the applications of even just the 200-some spatial analyst tools available in ubiquitous Esri software alone. Personally, I face these same problems in my work as data and GIS specialist at the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh, but they're not particular to my job there. They've come up in previous roles in the community development nonprofit world, as well as in my part-time work at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. While the problems I'm asked to solve may not be completely identical to those in similar strategic planning roles in other cities, I'm certain we would all benefit from a common solution so long as we were able to boil each problem down to the data needed to solve it. So what is the solution I'm proposing? A flexible fuzzy logic tool. This tool is inspired by my experiences and designed to solve my problems and bottlenecks, but its design is to make it applicable to those in other similar organizations. Fuzzy logic isn't new, and I'm not proposing I've invented or reinvented the wheel, but I want to bring its power out of academia and more technical discussions and afford more everyday GIS users access to it with minimal training. The tool will be configured to allow users to select the data and set parameters for their various scenarios while keeping the more in-depth technical processes automated in the background in a less daunting black box configuration. So now that I have your attention, let's get into the details. First off, multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA. This is a powerful way to leverage the combination of numerous conflicting data sets with expert knowledge to reach an outcome more methodically than relying on intuition alone. By defining which attributes are desirable in each layer and stacking each layer on top of the next, so to speak, GIS analysts have a way to define the most suitable locations in a study area based on the parameters they have set. Next, let's talk about how to define desirable attributes. One way to define an attribute's desirability is through binary or Boolean logic. Binary logic is based on defined membership of either being in or out. We see spatial and non-spatial examples of this in our daily lives in switches that are turned on or off, laws that define minimum ages for participation, such as consuming alcohol, and define jurisdictional boundaries that govern other rules and regulations, taxation rates, and more. In most cases, it's fairly easy to define if you're 21 or over or not, or if you're in Pennsylvania or not. We know, however, that some personal behaviors are governed more by cultural norms than rules set by arbitrary boundaries, and there are analytic processes such as weighted overlay that aim to explore this gray region between the black and white areas of binary logic. But that may not always do the trick. So let's explore fuzzy logic. Esri documentation states the basic premise behind fuzzy logic is that there are inaccuracies in the attributes and geometry of spatial data. We've all encountered poorly digitized layers that may be acceptable for some uses, but not for others. Do the blue lines on the map to the left accurately represent the hydrology on the base map? How accurate is accurate enough? And in which cases could these representations cause egregious errors in calculations? We also know that statistics and attributes of polygon layers are very much dependent on how point data is aggregated within them. These effects of the modifiable aerial unit problem can lead to biases and inaccuracies in our spatial data, which only get compounded downstream in our analyses. Esri notes further that when preparing data for spatial analysis, the sources of these inaccuracies in the attributes and geometry of spatial data, especially in the definition of classes, can cause imprecision in assigning cells to the specific classes, such as 1 to 10, 11 to 20, and 21 to 30. If your measurements are all 1 unit off, will the objects you're classifying be put into the wrong category? And are these defined classes even appropriate for the analysis at hand? And finally, according to Esri, fuzzy logic addresses situations when boundaries between classes are not clear. Thinking of a non-spatial example, most of us can think of specific heights for when a person could be classified as short or tall, but these classifications become even more subjective when introducing classes with modifiers, such as somewhat short or kind of tall. This problem is further compounded when relying on someone else to classify the same data, as personal and cultural differences and backgrounds also influence opinions of which classes an object or attribute belongs to. For a slightly different example, think of how someone from New York City classifies real estate prices as high or low versus how someone from a much smaller borough like State College would do the same. And what role could time play in these classifications? While the tools that utilize binary logic, like weighted overlay, are based on the use of crisp data, you may guess that tools utilizing fuzzy logic are based on fuzzy data. Crisp data has clearly defined classes that values either are a part of or are not. Fuzzy data has values that range from 0 to 1, with cell values of 1 definitely being included as members of the data set, and values of 0 definitely not members, with the maybes falling in between. Fuzzy logic and the fuzzy data within it allow us to explore the edge areas and include them in our analyses, especially since they may be entirely arbitrary to begin with. Considering the two images here, it is clear in the crisp data on the left that the star is not in either green polygon. Let's pretend they're walksheds, but it is close to 1. Thinking back to how personal behaviors are often not guided by arbitrary boundaries, fuzzy data allows us to explore if somewhat close is somewhat acceptable. The fuzzy data on the right allows us to see the star's possible membership to the green polygon or walkshed to the left of the image. This was easy to determine when examining one layer, but what about when we add more criteria to our analysis? We are discussing multi-criteria decision analysis after all. Even when we add only 3 more layers, it becomes difficult to determine the star's membership in any one layer and assign attributes to it. How close or not close is a star to the green polygons we saw before? What about the blue or red layers also in this analysis? Just imagine if we were running a scenario with 8, 10, or even 30 layers. This is where fuzzy overlay tools allow GIS users to determine any single location's possibility of being a desirable site based on its membership to our defined combination of criteria in the analysis. Now that we know NCDA and fuzzy logic, let's add a third component, automation. Data technicians of any skill level benefit from tools that save time and remove as many potential risks of human error as possible. Using Microsoft Excel as a non-spatial example, automation can be as simple as changing a field string to all uppercase characters, or something more convoluted like concatenating cell values or performing lookups to retrieve data from other workbooks. As GIS professionals, we work with automation more than we may realize when using native and custom geoprocessing tools. We often interact with panels that allow us to select data and set parameters, but ignore the inner workings of the tools so long as all goes according to plan. These processes are hidden from us in the black box that makes the entire process of using these complex tools more digestible, especially to novice users. This combination of multi-criteria decision analysis, fuzzy logic, and automation brings me to my goal and objectives. My overarching goal is to make fuzzy logic more accessible to GIS users outside academia, to users in organizations like mine. My objectives to accomplish this goal are to develop a flexible fuzzy logic tool and then apply this tool to answer real-world questions that relate to my work and the similar but often different questions colleagues of mine may also face. The flexible fuzzy logic tool will combine the pre-processing steps necessary for spatial analysis with fuzzy membership and fuzzy overlay. Combining these processes allows users to run multiple iterations of the same analysis while reducing instances of human error along the way. This tool will allow users to choose their own layers for the analysis and set membership domains and weights for each layer to incorporate the numerous, sometimes conflicting, preferences of multiple stakeholders and decision makers involved. I will then apply my tool to solve problems in 4 scenarios, 1 close to my work, and 3 others that colleagues in similar agencies may face. If time allows, I will also compare my tool's outputs with previous site selection decisions and reevaluate these previous decisions with new knowledge or updated criteria as possible. This will also highlight my tool's efficiency, assuming I'm able to show how the tool reduced the length of time the decision-making process took from X number of days to mere minutes. So what are my 4 proposed scenarios? My first scenario is selecting sites for an affordable housing development. This is important as cities move such developments that were previously out of sight, out of mind, into multi-use developments, mixing residential and commercial uses, and whose residents would be better served by incorporating cooling green spaces. As a quick side note, this scenario was part of my inspiration for this capstone project, as I'm currently working on an overarching real estate strategy for my organization and quickly learned that weighted overlay may not be the best tool for the job, given the data constraints discussed earlier. For this scenario, these are some of the criteria and layers I'm proposing to use. I won't expand upon them yet, but I'm happy to return to these during the Q&A period if you'd like. My second scenario is determining where to hang traps to detect the invasive, highly destructive emerald ash borer, or EAB. It can be quite costly for municipalities to remove dead trees that have been infested by EAB, but hanging traps requires time, equipment, and personnel, all of which equal money too. So identifying where vulnerable ash trees may be located, especially if an extensive tree inventory is not available, is key. Here are my proposed criteria and layers for this scenario. My third scenario is selecting tree planting locations for carbon sequestration to help a city meet its net zero carbon emissions goals. Trees have the added benefits of stabilizing land, preventing erosion, and cooling the air for residents' health, but poorly placed trees face competition with land use and development. These are my proposed criteria and layers for this scenario. Finally, my fourth scenario, and a popular topic among capstone presentations this semester, is identifying locations for electric vehicle or EV quick charging stations, which again can help a city meet its net zero carbon emissions goals. This will expand the range of a city's own EV fleet if it has one, as well as accommodate residents and attract visitors who have made or wish to make the switch. Here are my proposed criteria and layers for this scenario. So how will I do this? The technology I will use is ArcGIS Pro version 2.7. Esri products are ubiquitous in the GIS world, and Pro is their new standard. Keeping in mind my audience is a potential colleague of mine, I would like to help organizations that have already invested in this proprietary software, and especially the additional cost of extensions like Spatial Analyst, benefit from wider application of the software available to them. As we saw before, one can perform some spatial analysis by sight, but assigning real attributes that justify decisions requires a more elaborate tool set. If time allows, I would also like to create an alternative version to be used in ArcMap for those still clinging to legacy software, either due to cost or familiarity. Within ArcGIS Pro, I will construct my tool using Model Builder. Model Builder is a great way for chaining together combinations of tools and documenting processes and decisions made along the way. For users who wish to open the black box of my fuzzy logic tool, Model Builder is one level closer to human language than code, making it more decipherable than Python, which will allow them to see under the hood, so to speak, as they become more comfortable with more elaborate analysis and wish to further adjust the tool to meet their needs. My primary data sources will be open data portals, namely the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center, or WPRDC, and Pennsylvania Spatial Data Access, or POSDA, for local data. It's also an added benefit that I'm familiar with these as I already use these resources in my daily work. I will also gather data from other cities' open data portals, though I have not yet determined the specific cities I'll investigate. Looking at cities much bigger or smaller in a different region or even a different country will help showcase my tool's flexibility. The steps I will take are as follows. First, identify scenarios. Check. Second, attain expert knowledge on layers and their membership domains for each scenario, either through further investigation of the literature or by making contact with experts through my professional network. Then I will acquire data through the open data portals, build the fuzzy logic tool and Model Builder in ArcGIS Pro, test the tool in my 4 scenarios, and compare how the results differed from real world examples if possible. I will then adjust the tool as necessary to make sure it runs properly. And finally, I will package the tool to be shared as a custom geoprocessing tool that can be added to ArcGIS Pro and ArcMap, if time allows, and shared with a wider audience through my final capstone presentation. Hosting the tool on a platform like GitHub would likely not get it in the hands of my target audience, a potential colleague of mine who is less likely to navigate more code-centric hubs, but this is not entirely off the table just yet. The big challenge and limitations I will face are attaining the expert knowledge and finding the appropriate data for each scenario. There are a lot of open data portals and a lot of data on them, but it doesn't mean the right layers are always there. Additionally, my own lack of knowledge will certainly be local knowledge, will certainly be a limitation to evaluating my tools outputs in other cities. I may have local knowledge about Pittsburgh, but it will be difficult to know about the non-spatial criteria that go into decisions around site selection, like political influence or community input. After all, data is only an initial piece of the puzzle, and further engagement with stakeholders and the community is always necessary. My anticipated results are a packaged, flexible, fuzzy logic tool that combines the pre-processing steps necessary for spatial analysis with fuzzy membership and fuzzy overlay. This tool will be complete with help text and include error handling. My final capstone write-up will include a series of maps to demonstrate the tool's flexibility and efficiency in my 4 proposed scenarios, plus any others that may arise along the way. My proposed timeline is to complete the project work over the next couple months, present in the fall 2 2021 semester, and graduate this December. That being said, the effects of COVID are still ongoing, so I'm also proposing an extended timeline that would allow for some flexibility to present at a conference in person. Following this timeline, I would present my capstone project in the spring 1 2022 semester and graduate in May. The presentation venues I'm considering are based on these 2 timelines. The first 2 conferences for the American Association for Geographers and County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania follow the extended timeline, but would allow me to reach a wider audience. These last 2 venues, a WPRDC user group meeting or our internal Penn State MGIS capstone presentations, are a bit more flexible and could allow me to still graduate in December. Panos and I will be discussing which option may be best for us. Here are my references for this presentation. And if you haven't already, please enter your questions into the Zoom chat window and I will answer them aloud. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and allowing me to demystify the fuzz and share with you how I plan to build a flexible fuzzy logic tool. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was a great presentation.
Thank
Looks like
you.
you have a question in the chat already.
I really like the motivation behind this project. Will it be shared in any of our classes? That's a really good question, Beth. I'm definitely going to be using this in my daily work, but I'm happy to, include this in any future lesson materials or, sort of guest speaker or presentation possibilities that you and the other faculty think could be of use to other students in the program. Sounds good. Can you talk through how you think fuzzy logic might play out in one of your scenarios? I understand the concept in the abstract, but I'm a bit fuzzy on how it plays out in practice. Yeah, so I guess I'll go back to the scenario that relates more directly to the work I do. So in coming up with real estate strategy, we're trying to identify basically assign a score to parcels in one of 3 areas. 1 is an environmental score where property should not be developed. 2 is areas to expand market strength of strong markets and systematically grow them into the adjacent weaker markets. And a 3rd one is to identify areas of stronger markets where we could inject affordability or generate revenue through higher sales prices or interim uses. And so the way, I think one of the big components that we're looking at is proximity to transit. So based on some data provided by our local transit authority, the Port Authority of Allegheny County, they're focusing in their transit work and transit access work, sorry, of working with areas that are within a quarter-mile walk shed of bus stops and half-mile walk sheds of the light rail, we call it locally the T, and busway stations. And so, one of our big criterias in these real estate strategies are things that are proximate to transit, they're in these walk sheds, or they're close to job centers, or they're within 1 mile walk sheds to open schools. So it's easy to, select properties that are in that boundary or touch that boundary. But as humans, we don't follow, lines in the middle of the road necessarily. So, a property that's just outside that boundary is still worth considering. And so fuzzy logic allows, not just this in or out, you're in the boundary or not designation to be made, but also assign values so that if you're just over the boundary by some amount that you think is appropriate, you're still going to sort of be counted as being in the walk shed, but it's going to be obviously not be as close, but you'll be closer. You'll be considered more a member of the walk shed than if you were farther away by like 2 miles or so. And so users can set these criteria for what they want to definitely be considered part of the layer we're looking at, and how far may be too far, and then use different fuzzy membership equations or algorithms to define how quickly those changes occur. So you're definitely in, you're definitely out, but is there a lot of wiggle room in between that's kind of close enough, or is it a steep drop off where you're approaching something a little more like binary logic? I hope that was a convoluted way that eventually led to an answer for you. Great presentation and project idea, thank you. I think that using ArcGIS is the right way to go for your application. I'm wondering if you've investigated other options that may be able to perform fuzzy analysis are perhaps. I have not done that yet, but I was happy to get my toes wet with R during the MGIS program thus far, especially my course last summer. I guess I'm shying away from R for this particular one, knowing that, again, thinking to potential colleagues of mine at different levels of GIS experience, downloading new software, navigating the knowledge of what kind of libraries or packages need to be downloaded, how to do that scripting, to build the application and navigate all that. I think that would be really nice. And maybe there is a good way to make something more like a panel that would allow others to interact with that without knowing the code on the back end. I guess I'm trying to target more, those working with what they already have, and making the best of investments already made without necessarily having to learn something new, even though, like I said, we are all lifelong learners anyway.
So I have a question here. So kind of going off what Jim asked, I can imagine that your end user might find this tool to be non-trivial in its setting up, defining parameters, and so forth. Have you thought about having a sort of a user case study where you get feedback from potential users on the interface design of this tool to make sure that they understand exactly what they need to complete, fill, supply as parameters?
Yeah, so haven't taken into consideration like a more formal, survey and going through those requirements to include that in the capstone. But, my goal is to include as much help text and guidance as possible, or supporting documentation with the tool as possible. It's definitely, the more I've worked with the fuzzy logic tools in ArcGIS, they're definitely, you don't necessarily want to just put people in the driver's seat and have them drive off without consideration, for the variables they're entering. So definitely worth exploring more, and also emphasizing that the results the tool will produce shouldn't be the final decision made, right? There's still the engagement with other stakeholders and the community at large, because the decisions we make in our GIS software, they have real effects in the real world. So nothing should be done just on a whim.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for your explanation. Maybe the tool should come with like a warning message, right?
Yeah. Final step, talk to people. So
Right,
yeah.
right. All right, thanks again. Oh, we have one more from Bridget.
Yeah. You mentioned you'd like this to become an ArcGIS tool. Have you researched the process on how to get your tool officially part of the software? No, I haven't. But that's a great thing to consider, Bridget, and definitely would then, well, not only, self-serving, maybe provide some opportunities for me, but also get it in the hands of a wider audience, so that it's not in addition to the software people have. It just then comes natively with it. So thank you for that idea. Thanks, and same to you.
All right, thanks again, Tim, for your interesting presentation. Next up, we'll hear from Andrew Fahey. So, Andrew, if we could get you to start sharing your screen, that'd be great. And we can't hear you.
Now you can.
Now we can, yes.
Cool. I'm just stalling while I get this up and running.
Your volume is really low.
Okay. Any better?
Not so much.
Well, let me go into settings here then. Here, let me just use this.
Does that
Much better, much better.
Okay. Cool. I'll just mute you guys for the next 20 minutes or so. I'll lose those. All right, let me get my screen shared before you go. Please.
So we can see your screen.
Be able to see it now.
And we can hear you clear. So whenever you're ready.
Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you're all doing well. And thank you so much for tuning in today to assess our project proposals. I'll be discussing county scale analysis of educational attainment and public health. And
Actually,
so the general background here,
Andy, if I can
or the general
interrupt.
outline as it is, will be the background, which is going to discuss the relationship between education and health, how geography enters into that equation and research objectives, while the methodology will then be discussing the study area, the data involved, and the analysis involved, and then expected results and challenges, and timeline and conference venue, and then of course, finally, time for questions and references as well. And so education, as a lot of you might have noticed, being in a master's program does take a substantial amount of time in your lifetime. Compulsory state laws do require, on average in the US, about 11 years to receive a general education diploma. And if you're adding things like preschool or higher education, up to the doctorate. Oh, I'm so sorry. I realize. Sorry, I noticed in the chat. Sorry about that. Why would it present here? Yeah, sorry. Present different screen then. Let's see how that works. How about now? That should work a little bit better. Sorry, I'm much more used to MS Teams at work, so Zoom's not necessarily my forte. Sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, I'll be discussing county level scale analysis of educational attainment and health. And I'll be going through the background, which is discussing the relationship between education and health, how geography enters that equation, research objectives. Then I'll be going on to methodology to discuss study area and data and analysis involved, expected results and challenges, timeline, conference venue, references, and questions at the end. And so, as you can imagine, education does take a substantial amount of time in your life, on average 11 years for a general education. But things like preschool, higher education, trade schools, specializations of some kind like a doctorate can add substantially. So getting a general education takes roughly 1/7 of an average lifespan in the US, which is 78.5 years. But if you add all those kind of optional degrees and whatnot, that can be up to 1/3. So it is an incredibly influential aspect of your life, as you can imagine. It helps define your occupational possibilities and life choices, either directly or indirectly based on if you move or what have you. Health, the past year or so has certainly been more of a focus, but even in general, it is a very large focus of government organizations, because it is literally the well-being of the constituents in which they're meant to represent. And then also it is clearly a economic cost that they have to consider at all times. But it is one thing that is immensely complex to measure as well. If I were to ask you to measure health, I can imagine a lot of you would come up with different ways of doing it, because there's a multitude of explanatory variables, things like income and education certainly, and available health services, but there's also different outputs that you can get. You can get outcome variables such as life expectancy or age-adjusted mortality, or you can have behavioral variables, which are more dietary, exercise, drug use, alcohol consumption, what have you. So there's a lot of different ways for things to go into the equation, a lot of ways to display the outcome of the equation. And so the relationship is between the two, educational attainment and public health, is well documented for several decades, at least as far back as I went, but I'm certain it's further than that. And it is very positively correlated. More education generally leads to a longer and healthier life. But the literature that I was seeing is a bit fuzzier on to what degree it's causal. Different results because of the complex situation with health and education, as you can imagine. But also importantly is who's doing the research and to what ends. Changes what sort of variables they'll be looking at. But also more importantly, is where people are looking and at what scale, because geography is important, and the scale is important because in the past, I would say 15 years, literature has been focusing more on geography, because those different scales will highlight different trends. At national scale, you'll be seeing more of a generalized assessment, positive correlation between education and health, but on the county level, on the state and county level, that can change. So even though I highlighted life expectancy being 78.5 years in the US, the figure there shows you that is not, it is heterogeneous where that actually happens, like where that is in the US. So smaller scales can offer greater contextualization behind the relationship, and that greater contextualization leads to more actionable information for a decision maker at any scale, really. The literature is focused more on state political boundaries, perhaps because of compulsory state laws being a common reason to make that distinction. However, literature also highlights counties as being an important political, demographic unit, spatial unit to use. It's one of the smallest ones that we can. And so, but not much literature is focused on that. I only found one source really describing the relationship at that spatial scale. And so it's important to kind of look at that scale as well, because it can help simplify how complicated that measuring these things are when you can put it into a box and kind of figure out what is kind of actually being involved at different locations. So simplifying it is certainly one thing, and just exploring how space gets more involved in this is another. And in governance, this is certainly applicable because it helps drive policy decisions for folks, and certainly resource management, considering budgetary restraints. The research objectives of this, the first and second, are a little bit merged, but it will be assessing and comparing state and county level, the relationship between educational attainment and public health. I'll be exploring further what patterns show up at the county scale for spatial correlations. And then I'll be doing a assessment of two different regression models, one being a local, one being a global regression model, to see how that changes the patterns that show up. The study area I decided on mostly came from one study that highlighted that educational disparity between the mid-1980s to 2011 was heterogeneous, in the sense that Illinois had a decreasing mortality across all education levels. However, Missouri had an increasing mortality for people who didn't have a high school education. And I just knew offhand that St. Louis is right in that little cleft at the border. And I was curious, well, what does that look like on the county scale? Because I don't imagine that that state line necessarily applies so strictly. And so I wanted to explore the relationship there, in particular, to neighboring states. And likewise, Chicago is also there, and it's a very massive metropolitan area, termed Chicagoland, apparently. My main data source is the University of Wisconsin Public Health Institute. They're kind of aggregate data from a lot of different sources, mostly from federal agencies, and they have access to county scale data from surveys that generally will release it to the public at the state level. So they kind of eliminate that obstacle for me. In terms of education, the main variable that they capture would be educational attainment for credentials, specifically credential attainment. And they capture that in 5-year estimates, most recent one being 2014 to 2019. And it's from the American Community Survey given by the Census Bureau. They do capture enrollment too, but the age ranges differ. Enrollment captures age 3 and above. Educational attainment, credential attainment, I should say, is age 25 and above. And so it's hard to differentiate who falls into what population. So I'm focusing only just on the one variable, on credential attainment specifically. And I'm going to be breaking it down to 4. No high school, bachelor's, graduate, just because the literature seems to make those generalizations. Although it does capture associate's degree, that one I'm leaving out just so that way it's a bit more of a more generalized blocks, I should say. Health outcomes, I'm going to be focusing on 2 variables. Premature age adjusted mortality, which originally comes from a federal source, National Center for Health Statistics. And then self-reported poor or fair health from disease and Center for Disease Control. From their survey, premature age adjusted mortality comes from a 3-year estimate, 2017, 2019 being most recent. And then the self-reported poor or fair health is an annual survey. It's not aggregated in any way. So I'm focusing on these because the literature uses these most commonly. So I felt like I should follow suit. The health behaviors are a little bit trickier. This isn't human geography, and social demography are not necessarily my forte. And so although I can make educated guesses on things like obesity or alcohol consumption being involved, I want to use more of a technical approach to try and explore what variables might actually be most credible in using. And so I'll be doing, there's a tool in ArcGIS Pro, and I think in ArcMap as well, called exploratory regression, which will, you input every variable that you want to input, and it will cycle through every permutation of them to give you the significance of each regression model therein from all the permutations. And so that will identify significance in which models will be significant, but it will also do a secondary thing, which will be important to me, considering this isn't necessarily my field. It will identify variables that need further data manipulation, like it will identify spatial autocorrelation, it will identify multicollinearity between variables, it will identify skewness in certain variables. So knowing that, I can take it back out, do some manipulation, put it back in, see how it turns out. And so I anticipate that it will give me things like obesity and whatnot, but I can't necessarily be sure. And I expect to use 4 to 5 in the analysis. And so knowing the health behavior variables, I'll be doing ordinarily squared regression analyses with the health outcomes being the dependent variables. And I'll be cycling through each education. So I'll be doing age adjusted mortality for one output, and then the 4 educational attainment levels, but then I'll be switching to self-reported fair or poor health and switching and going through the credential again for a total of 8. The next slide will explain a little bit more visually, if that in a kinder manner. It's more digestible, but behavior variables will remain constant through all 8. And then the geographic weighted regression tool is one that takes space into account and does a local model for each one. I expect to do a Poisson model for each county. And I'll use the same variables as OLS, but it's going to do something helpful, which is get rid of some of the fuzziness beyond a certain barrier. So if you look at Cook County, which is the red up there in the image, that's where the city of Chicago is, but Chicagoland, the greater metropolitan area, actually spans 14 counties. That actually bleeds into Indiana and Wisconsin. And so I can specify, hey, only look at these 8 other counties in Illinois and take that into account in your regression and analysis, and do that for the rest, because the area around St. Louis doesn't necessarily have an effect on Chicago. And so I want to do that analysis to see what's different, to make this a little bit more visually pleasing. The preliminary study will be the exploratory regression in ArcGIS Pro. I'm using 2.4 right now, but I might upgrade that as well to determine the health behavior variables. Then I'll do the OLS regression models. And on the right there is all 8 of the models that will be done. I'll do the same exact analysis at the county level. The state level will be an aggregation of averages. If the data sources themselves don't have it, which I believe they have because I've seen them, and see what the difference is between the two. And then I'll see what the difference is between OLS and geographic weighted regression. And so what I anticipate is that it'll correspond positively to the literature that I've seen, that a positive relationship between educational attainment and population health exists, but that is independent of state boundaries, kind of highlighting the counties that are worth looking at the scale for this particular relationship. And then also that a local model will demonstrate a greater variance than a global model, and that might be a bit more applicable to this sort of analysis as well. There's a lot of challenges and limitations and assumptions that are being made. However, I want to be optimistic and say that there are opportunities for further study. The educational data doesn't capture quality, public versus private institutions, Ivy League versus community college, is simply just not captured, and it's a complicated subject in itself to measure. So I can't necessarily capture it myself. Things like trade schools aren't captured in these credentials. Specializations, I can assume a graduate level degree would also count for a medical degree, for example, but that's a bold assumption. I'm assuming that the data is representative of the population because a lot of the other data sources, and why I'm using this, these sorts of sources, are a lot of surveys will capture where you're born and where you ended up without any in between. And then also generally the literature has shown that they're restricted data sets because of personal information, I imagine. And so I wanted to use the more publicly available county level data. But because those surveys had that anchor point of the individual and like how they connected to their health and education, I don't get that anchor. I'm assuming that the data sets coincide with each other appropriately. So I can't necessarily incorporate like demographics, for example, because I don't know which race has X amount of educational attainment or what have you. I'm also unable to incorporate a temporal aspect for now. I might be able to identify one in the future, and if that is something I can identify, I can proceed with that direction. But a lot of the data sets don't go back far enough to comfortably make a temporal assessment. And one of the biggest assumptions in a lot of this literature that there doesn't seem to be an answer for is migration. That aspect of the, we capture where you were born, we capture where you are now, and missing that, entire lifespan where you might have been is not something that is accountable for just in these surveys. So it's not something I can account for, and I can only assume that it is not strong enough to, alter the results significantly. The timeline, very briefly, I'll be doing my data collection and analysis during the summer, and with the expectation to present my results in fall, and also take Geog 596B and graduate in December. And these are some proposed sites, but as prior presenters have demonstrated, with what's going on, it's hard to know what's available and what's not in terms of virtual versus in person. Ideally, I'd like to do it in person, but these are some of the ones that have been identified that are a bit more optimistic in whether or not we can do it in person. So those are the ones I'm identifying here, but it's in all honesty to be determined with me and Mike Nasri. And so these are my references. And with that, I thank you very much. And I thank my advisor, specifically Mike Nasri, for helping me, for advising me and guiding me in this trajectory. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Specifically on regression models, I'm certainly excited for input on that, because that is not something that I'm incredibly familiar with, one that I can bolster more. So
All right. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That was a great presentation. Looks like you might have a question already in the chat window.
Let me get out of this and stop sharing. Okay, Greg, you are asking, are you planning to control for values that would impact health, like wealth or access to care? Currently, no. From the literature, access to care isn't necessarily something incredibly swaying in the equation. Wealth or income does explain a small portion of it. Well, not small, I should say a significant portion, but right now that's not necessarily something I'm going to incorporate. But it's something that I can in the future if it leads to obstacles.
while we're waiting for other folks to ask questions, I had a question on your regression models. You were looking at each independent variable against the dependent variable. So creating separate I think you have what, 8 separate models? You might want to think about perhaps including all the independent variables together as a way to see how they interact together, and in combination, which of those variables would be more significant in predicting your dependent variable.
Right. It might have been me mis-explaining, or maybe I just don't understand regression enough. But although health behaviors will remain constant, I'm going to be switching out the educational ones with the assumption that significance will increase as higher education goes up for each model. And so
Okay.
I'll be capturing most independent variables together in the models. I'll just be cycling through each educational attainment to see how that changes things.
Oh, okay. All right. All right.
Sorry about that. That was a bit convoluted in the presentation. My fault. Greg, again, have you looked at health measure data from CDC places or countyhealthrankings.org? Countyhealthrankings.org is actually, I think, where I'm getting my data from. Because that's the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. But yes, I have looked at that. And that's where I'm going to hopefully get all of my stuff from, as a one-stop shop for these sorts of, having all of it aggregated in one place. My advisor and I also talked a lot about the 500 Places project, which is very granular city data. Cities, I was considering looking at cities too. My difficulty with that is that it kind of limits the space in between them. So county, at least I can account for all the land that's being included. That's why I'm focusing on county. However, that's another trajectory that I can look at as well. And thank you very much for the suggestion. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, looks like it might be done with questions. So again, thank you very much for a great presentation, and best of luck on your 596B part.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.
So next up is Justin Frazier. So Justin, if you want to start sharing your screen. Or maybe Justin isn't here yet. Yeah, yeah, Jennifer, I see that we're running a little bit early.
I'll try finding him and letting him know we're running early.
Okay. Hello there, Justin.
Hey, everybody.
So if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, we could just get right into it.
So we can see your screen, and whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, great. Yeah, so first off, I want to thank everybody for coming and being here and taking out the time of your day. So first off, my presentation is going to be on spatial impact analysis of hydraulic fracking on federal land and specifically in Utah. So specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the Uintah Basin. So this includes 59 parcels near Dinosaur National Monument, which happens to include pristine and untouched land that is visited by over 300,000 people every year. So there was basically a proposal in December of 2020. A federal judge rejected this approval of a 2018 proposal to introduce large-scale fracking and fossil fuel extraction to over 60,000 acres in this basin. And this proposal was recently overturned as it was deemed that the Bureau of Land Management violated the law by not considering all alternatives to leasing the land. But this essentially prevented over 2,800 wells to be drilled in the region. So this capstone will be taking a scenario-based approach to see how the protected land in the Uintah Basin and Utah as a whole would have been affected by the hydraulic fracking if it was to be introduced. So as you can see here, we have current oil and gas wells in the Uintah Basin. So the Uintah Basin is located right here in this red circle. And here are all of the current oil and gas wells. So as you can see, there's quite a bit. And the addition of 2,800 more would have mattered quite a bit. So some of the research questions that I'll be thinking about and that I have thought about during my research and going into this capstone. So first off, the area of interest is Utah, more specifically the Uintah Basin. And then I'll be thinking about what are the impacts of hydraulic fracking to surrounding communities and how can spatial analysis be used to generate and interpret them. I'll also be thinking about how are these impacts affected federally, how are these impacts affecting federally protected land and including but not limited to the Uintah Basin? What is the trajectory of these impacts if nothing is changed? And how severe would these impacts be if the new wells had been introduced to the area, such as in the case of the 2020 federal proposal that did not go through? So one of the things I found out when I was researching was that there was a study done by the Department of Geosciences at Mississippi University that was very similar to what I'm going to be looking at, except they did their study on an area in Pennsylvania. So as stated previously, studies have found that hydraulic fracking threatens water resources, harms air quality, and changes landscapes and damages the ecosystem. However, there's minimal research focusing on the spatial study of environmental and human risks of fracking, which is necessary for state and federal government to administer, regulate, and assess hydraulic fracking. So in the study by the Mississippi University, they use GIS and spatial kernel density functions to implement and analyze the risk impacts associated with these wells across the Marcellus Shale region in Pennsylvania. So the data that they needed for analysis included hydraulic fracturing well locations, parcels, urbanized region data, railways, local regional roads, hydrography, and wetlands. So for my capstone project, I'm going to be utilizing a very similar approach, except focusing on the Uintah Basin in Utah. So the data I'm going to be looking at is hydraulic fracturing well locations, parcels, urbanized region data, railways, local and regional roads, hydrography, and wetlands. And some of the methods I'll be going into, I'll be implementing spatial interpolation and density methods to analyze the risk impacts associated with these wells across the Uintah Basin and greater state of Utah. I will perform overlay analysis to measure how much of this impacted land is federally protected. I will approach using scenario-based methodology to see how surrounding areas would have been impacted if the federal proposal was approved for the addition of the fracking wells in the Utah Basin. this would include creating a model to simulate the impacts of fracking wells to the surrounding land and then running it on my study area to see how much of it would have been affected. So as you can see here, I put together a few quick overlay maps. So these 6 counties in Utah, you can see down here where they're located in Utah, but these 6 counties are what basically make up the Uinta Basin. So here you can see overlaid on federal land. You know, we have Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Redamation, Department of Defense, and all the federal land that should be protected here on this area. Then we have our shale basins. These are the target areas where fracking wells would be created because fracking wells take place on shale basins. Here we have our existing wells. As you can see, a lot of these wells overlay with federal land, and most of them overlay with the shale basin as well. In fact, I think all of them do. So that just gives you an idea of how all of this data is relevant to one another and how they interact with one another. So then protected lands and the uncertain future. So protected land is designated land that is set aside and protected because it was deemed a certain level of importance due to biological diversity and abundance of natural or cultural resources. So currently, a protection status is enough to prevent natural resource extraction from these areas. However, these lands are decreasing before our eyes due to widespread legal changes undermining these protection policies. So governments of the US and Amazonian countries have already enacted 269 and 440 PADDD areas, which are protected area downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement. So these are events, basically protected land is downgraded to being not protected for various reasons. So between 1892 and 2018, 73 countries enacted 3,749 PADDD events, removing 519,000 square kilometers from protection and tempering regulations, and an additional 1,600,000 square kilometers. So 78% of these events were enacted since 2000, and 62% of these PADDD events are associated with industrial scale resource extraction and development. So this highly suggests that PADDD may compromise biodiversity conservation objectives and are often caused by industrial scale resource extraction, such as fracking. So now we're going to get into what exactly is hydraulic fracking. So hydraulic fracking is a technique used to enable the extraction of natural gas or oil from shale and other forms of tight rock. In other words, impermeable rock formations that lock in oil and gas and make fossil fuel production difficult. So this involves the stimulation of the shale using a combination of water, sand, and a chemical cocktail that contains over 700 chemicals to shake loose and free the natural gas. So once the fracking material is pumped down the well, that is around 1 to 2 miles deep, it is then sucked up and the natural gas is then harvested to generate energy. So as hydraulic fracking is a fairly new practice, really taking hold in the last 10 or so years, the long-term effects have yet to be measured to their fullest extent. However, long-term health, environmental, and economic effects have been measured in areas that hydraulic fracking is centered around. So as it stands, hydraulic fracking has been named one of the least sustainable forms of energy sources by the Environmental Protection Agency. So again, what are the impacts of hydraulic fracking? So we have environmental, economic, and ethical. These are the 3 E's of sustainability. I'm sure everyone or a lot of people are aware of that. So first we'll get into our environmental impacts of hydraulic fracking. So water supply. So according to the EPA, hydraulic fracking process utilizes billions of gallons per year on a national level. On a more local scale, this amounts to around 1.5 million gallons per well every year. This statistic puts high strain on local water supplies, which may already be running low. So in these cases where the water supplies gets too low, water is often transported from other regions, which ultimately puts a regional strain on all surrounding rivers and lakes. And another thing that is affected on the environmental aspect is water quality. So chemicals used in the fracking process may leak into the water table. So in a 2015 report from the EPA, it was released that there were 151 spill cases of these chemicals, and 13 of these cases where the chemicals were found in the surface water supplies. In addition, the main byproduct of fracking is billions of gallons of wastewater annually that is kept in above ground or underground storage pits. And there's always potential for these storage pits to have leaks. Another environmental impact of hydraulic fracking is methane gas. So US oil and gas industries emits 13 million metric tons of methane annually, and the EPA estimates that the fugitive emission rate to be about 1.4%, roughly 182 million tons of methane. So methane is known as a major greenhouse gas, with statistics that show methane having a global warming potential of 84 times that of carbon dioxide on a 20-year horizon and 25 times on a 100-year horizon. So it is also worth noting that this past Wednesday, Senate actually voted to reinstate an Obama-era regulation designed to clamp down on methane emissions. So this regulation essentially imposes the federal limits on methane leaks from oil and gas wells. So this requires companies to monitor, plug up, and capture leaks of any methane from these new drilling sites. So now we'll get into the ethical impacts of hydraulic fracking. So often hydraulic fracking comes with uneven distributions of risks and social impacts to local communities surrounding the sites, and these risks must be balanced against economic benefits to developers. So along with these unfair conditions and risks to surrounding communities, it has been scientifically confirmed that hydraulic fracking does in fact contribute to chronic health conditions such as severe headaches, asthma-like symptoms, cancer, childhood leukemia, and birth defects. And now we can get into the economic impacts of hydraulic fracking. So in 2005, hydraulic fracking was exempt from federal reach. This means that fracking regulations have been left to be state-run, which leaves more room for lobbying of these energy companies. This has far-reaching effects in almost every aspect that fracking touches. As fracking has expanded and become more complex, some states have sought to squash local government efforts to impose more stringent policies. So this leaves the public to fight for these more stringent policies and ultimately results in a divided front. This is ultimately an effective display of the role of regulated interests that prefer state regulations to federal regulations, and how this results in a weak and under-standardized regulatory regime with blurry lines. And here's my works cited with all my research articles that I used to come up with this presentation. So. And now I'll open up to any questions that anyone may have.
All right, Justin, great presentation.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see some questions pop up in the chat window. Looks like you have a question.
Got it. All right, great question, Ryan. So Ryan asked about if I could explain more about these scenarios and will I be adding well locations to a map somehow? Most likely I will not be adding well locations to a map per se. Most likely I will be analyzing first how well locations already affect the surrounding land. And then I will be mostly probably by creating a model. And then I'll be running that model on land that would have been affected per that initial proposal that was not put through in 2020. So first I'll be creating the model and then running the model on land that would have been affected. I hope that answers your question.
So I have a quick question. Obviously, other states, Pennsylvania, West Virginia have seen a lot of fracking take place over the past few years. Are you going to tap into any of the consequences or outcomes from those states to help you model your approach?
Yep. So if I go back to one of my slides, there was that the case study done in PA by the Department of Geosciences at Mississippi University. I'm going to be taking a lot of inspiration from that study because PA is such a high risk area for fracking. In addition to Virginia, like you just said, or West Virginia. So I'm going to be looking pretty deep into this study and kind of basing my study off of this, just in the state of Utah and more specifically the Uintah Basin.
Okay, thanks. Looks like another question popped up.
Oh. So I may have missed this, but why did you include railways? So railways is I'm not totally sure why they included railways. I'm assuming it just has to do with the same reason they would include roads, just transporting resources and whatnot to and from these sites. So that I think that's why they would include railways and local and regional roads. I do not live in the Utah area. I do have personal ties. I've been to Utah multiple times. Love hiking in the area, just outdoor recreation in the area. So it's definitely a place close to my heart. So. Hey, Bridget. Yeah, that's a great idea. Bridget mentioned looking at historical earthquake data in the Uintah Basin to see if they increased in frequency over time in relation to the addition of fracking wells. That's definitely a great idea. I have looked deeper into whether fracking wells do cause seismic activity in affected areas, and there is definitely evidence to support that. So that is definitely a great point to look into as I get deeper into this.
All right, well, that looks like the end of the questions. Thanks again, Justin, for your interesting presentation. I'd like to take a moment to thank all the presenters today. They all did great jobs, and I wish them all the best in their development of their capstone project for 596B. I would like to remind everyone there is another 596A presentation scheduled for Monday starting at 11:30. So I hope to see everyone there. But otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and we'll hopefully see